Hey, ecologists. So we're coming up on what is now shoot, 4 year? No, 3 years. 3 year, I don't like the word anniversary, but for lack of a better term, 3 year anniversary of the very first video I made for this podcast. So I recorded it right around this time, 3 years ago, released it, or I should say, published it to the channel. I think it was in February. But yeah, it was around this time 3 years ago. So January, February, winter of 2021. It's now 2024, so we're 3 years out. Earlier this morning, I was listening to the video I recorded last year around this time, so my deconstruction story 2 years later. So this is now my deconstruction story 3 years later. So, where am I at now? That's one of the things I'll talk about. And I think, no surprise here, like I still do not identify as a Christian. But one interesting thing, more recently, I have started going back to a Christian church. But my reasons for that are not, are definitely not to worship Jesus. I think there is still, like from time to time, I still feel some openness. It comes much more sporadically now in terms of being open to Christianity specifically, but I lived with it for so long and I still have, so many people in my life, who still identify as Christian. Many of whom are close family and friends. That I think that more than anything, the social connection that I share with these people, that I'm loath to sacrifice, or it's still hard, because like the further I go down I'm not a Christian and I need to feel the need to speak out about the harmful elements of Christianity. The further I went down that path back when I was speaking more regularly, more publicly about it, the more I worried about, as much as I wanted to help those people, the more I also worried about loss of connection, loss of attachment with them, which is very hard for any human. If your social group, the people you've known, that you're connected to, that you rely on, they rely on you, loss of connection, loss of attachment is very frightening. And honestly, I think it's the reason why a lot of people, even though they have serious doubts, and many of whom, if you were to ask them privately, might not even say they believe in the Orthodox doctrine of Christianity, remain in the church because of the connections there, because of the community that has been built up. I mean, you're thinking this community of Christianity, which is 2 billion strong at this point, roughly, it's been growing for 2,000 years, right? Close to it. Since the earliest Christians in the first century, began writing about the movement, the religion, and, talking like towards the end of the first century into the second century, what you would call the church fathers, writing about this growing movement, this growing religion, which obviously they saw as the one true faith. I think at that point, the one way of having a relationship with God, of having eternal life, etc. That's been going on for almost 2,000 years. So it's a long damn time, right? To a buildup of tradition. You've had millions and millions, billions, literally billions of people have been a part of this tradition. So it's very well established, very ingrained, particularly in my society, in American society, not to mention other European societies, although they're moving away from that as a whole in Europe. But it's still there. It's still woven into much of the fabric of their societies and certainly of their history. And even as they may be moving beyond it, their roots are still, obviously they go way further back than Christianity. If you want to get into humanity's roots and the root of human culture, it goes much, much, much further back. We're talking tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands, even potentially years beyond the origin of Christianity. So Christianity is kind of the new kid on the block, but it is the most popular currently, and one of the more recent and most popular. But obviously, from the perspective of a life that only is 70 to 80 years, your average person, right? 2,000 years is a long time. So it's been around a minute. You know what I'm saying? Buddhism is older by roughly 500 years or so, give or take. You have some other religions that are older. I mean, obviously Judaism itself, which I think Orthodox Jews obviously would distinguish themselves from Christians. They do not identify in any way with Jesus as their Messiah. You know, um, that goes further back. Rewind back maybe another 1,000 to 1,500 years further back than Christianity. You get into things like Zoroastrianism. Is older than Christianity. Obviously, Egyptian religions, which for the most part are not practiced anymore. Those are older. But it currently is one of the oldest continually practiced religions. But if you get into what you might call or identify as religious practices or spiritual practices, there are some that are much, much older than Christianity. For instance, some of the spiritual practices of people that live up in the Arctic Circle who have lived there, they have oral history dating back 30,000 years. Similar, the Aborigine people, which, forgive me, I don't know if that's the name they have for themselves. It's the one I'm most familiar with, but the Aborigine people in Australia, who lived there far longer than the European settlers that came. Obviously, they have, I think, oral histories going back a similarly long period of time. So their religious views, are far older. But it's a bit of a misnomer, too, because Christianity itself, it's not a religion. It didn't just pop out of the ground, you know what I'm saying? Like, it descended from a line of other traditions and was kind of a synthesis of, I would say, of Greek thought, and I think definitely Persian thought, like Greek, Persian, and Jewish or Semitic, if you want to use that term, thought. Like ancient Near Eastern thought. Basically, it was a fusion of multiple types of ancient Near Eastern and Mediterranean thought. I think when you get to the first century, like, I would say, and I'm not an expert on this, but from what I have studied and what I have observed, I think Greek culture and Greek thought had as much influence on the Christian writers. Maybe not as much on Jesus or whoever wrote Jesus' stories. Obviously, he himself did not write it down. But I think this is my personal theory. I think a Hellenistic Jew probably wrote, the Gospels, like Mark, Matthew, Luke. Like, these are Jews that, even by virtue of the fact that they had been conquered, been a part of the Greek Empire for a time, and the Greek culture, both because of that empire, but also because, the Roman Empire adopted a lot of Greek culture as well. So if Greek and Roman culture have heavily influenced, I mean, it's cultural diffusion. It happens. Like, you almost can't avoid it. You have pockets of, obviously, of Jewish people who try to retain to the old ways, ultra-Orthodox, if you want to call them that. To some extent, if I understand it correctly, some of the Maccabean revolts were about some of that. Some of the wars and things, the conflicts were between those that didn't want to adopt new ways of thinking, that wanted to hold to the old ways, if you will, didn't want to synthesize things. And you had conflicts with other Jews who were okay with, adopting some Greek thought or, And that was, I think, as I understand it, those are some arguments going on in the first century. So I'm acting a bit academic here. I suppose to some extent that's how my brain works, but back to where I'm at. Like, when I go back and revisit the arguments that convinced me to leave, both academic and moral, I'm reminded of why I left. Like, yeah, actually that was a good decision. And I thought through it very thoroughly. Did I think through every possible single angle? No, of course not. But enough that I'm like, no, this isn't this isn't good. We need to move beyond this. We need to evolve, if you will, beyond this, to grow beyond these ways of thinking. And to me, like the roots of Christianity, which obviously the the scriptures, the canonical, what we call the Bible, is the biggest root, if you will, the most obvious as well, I would say. Like the scriptures, the writings, obviously the writings of Paul and Jesus being the two most prominent, but also writings of the early church fathers, if you know, and then of course the Jewish writings that make up what most Christians commonly call the Old Testament. So these are the roots, and I would say like the roots are poisoned and rotten, and like we need to find another tree, either one that's already existing or we need to plant another one. You know what I'm saying? And I keep coming back to that place, but that is not easy. It's so much easier to just like let's try and reinvent Christianity, which it has been. People have been trying to do that and continue to do that thousands of years later. And one of the reasons it is adaptable in that way to a large extent is the fact that the sacred book, it isn't just the writing of one person. It's an anthology of potentially at least 36 different authors, and who knows how many editors were involved, in compiling. And then obviously the people that are involved in compiling it, there are a lot of people involved in not only writing it but interpreting it, and you have a long history of that now. So the potential, people are attracted or gravitate towards different ideas. You have different authors and different, I would argue, different perspectives on God or the gods, the nature of humanity, the afterlife. You have differing perspectives because you have different people who lived in different time periods throughout Jewish history. And even though the editors tried to make some of that consistent, and the people who compiled the canon tried to pick the epistles or the documents that were relatively consistent with one another, you still see the differences in personality of the writers, different ideas, conflicting ideas in many cases. And depending on what you're attracted to as a person or as a religious leader, you can kind of select the ideas that you resonate with the most and choose to emphasize those. And in some sense, you can reinvent Christianity. But again, the roots, going back to the roots, what you call the Orthodox doctrine, which majority of Christians, regardless of the iteration, agree on things like the deity of Jesus, for instance, that Jesus is the same being, the same entity as Yahweh that you see in the Old Testament, the same being, that he is Yahweh in flesh, if you will, Yahweh who has also become human somehow, a divine human hybrid. But he is one with Yahweh. He is Yahweh. Yahweh is him. They are the same entity. The Trinity, the three in one, but it's the same entity, right? So the way I see that, if you're going to propose that, that means that Jesus is equally responsible for everything that Yahweh said or did. And the only thing approaching an authoritative, record of what Yahweh did or said would be the Old Testament, right? I mean, those are the only, aside from one possible reference in an Egyptian hieroglyph that has been found, as I think citing Israelites as worshipers of Yahweh, and don't quote me on that, but I'm going off the top of my head here. The Hebrew Bible, if you will, the Jewish religious text, the Hebrew Bible, is the only record we have of this God Yahweh, right? Aside from possibly some archaeological finds that might reference him, I think there's been a few, but for the most part, the texts that have been passed down, that's the only record we have. So going off of that, if you propose that Yahweh and Jesus are the same entity, then logically it follows that Jesus is responsible for everything Yahweh said and did, in the Old Testament, if you will, as Christians call it, the Old Testament. So everything, and again, that's if you propose that as I think it's fair to say most conservative Christians, most Orthodox Christians do propose that that's an accurate portrayal of what Yahweh/Jesus did and said, right? Of his interactions with humans, both the miraculous and what you might call the mundane, and just conversations as well as events and interventions. So if you go back and look closely and as thoroughly and with as much objectivity as you can muster, like trying to examine this being, trying to separate them from yourself and just examine them as objectively as you possibly can, looking at what they did and said, can you really say that they have humanity's best interest in mind? Can you really say that they are trustworthy, consistent, just, and fair? And I would argue that no, you can't say that. And as I've said before, this is definitely one of the biggest reasons why I'm still not a Christian. So to put it bluntly, I can't get past the genocide. That being one of the biggest problems. Obviously, the genocide more than once, on more than one occasion, is commanded by Yahweh, who again, according to Orthodox doctrine, is the same being as Jesus. So Yahweh, you could just insert Jesus' name there, is commanded by Jesus, right? Yahweh/Jesus, the Christian God, if you will, or Jewish, just the Christians propose it's the same entity. So Jesus was fully responsible for what was said and done by Yahweh. They're the same person, right? Different aspects of the same person, if you want to put it that way. Different parts of the same person. So you have, as I began to look at that with more objectivity, this was part of my deconstruction process, was looking at that with more objectivity, trying my best to not take it for granted that this is God, like a record of God, or that God is the author of this book, trying to look at it as a human book first, because I know and we can establish at least that it's written by humans, right? I think that's a very reasonable conclusion based on the evidence we have that these books were written by humans. These texts were written and transmitted and passed down by humans. And I don't think any Christian would disagree with that. And not even the most Orthodox. I mean, they're going to say, well, of course, yeah, they were God's instruments, right? He worked through them to write the text, right? So we at least know it was written by humans. And trying to look at this being and how he treats his people. As the story goes, he supposedly chose these people. He chose the Israelites. He chose them even though they were a small people group compared to like other empires, like say, they were relatively small in comparison to some of the empires around at that time. Not compared to other people groups, not compared to other countries, I would say necessarily, but like compared to some of the empires that continued to dominate that part of the world, the ancient Near East, relatively small, or at least they saw themselves that way. So God supposedly, Yahweh supposedly chose them. He chose them, going back to Abraham. He chose Abraham first, right? And then chose to, through his descendants, create a people for himself. In a different way, because he technically owns all the other people too, right? He is responsible for their creation and their existence, right? Under the idea that he's the creator. But he wanted a special people group to kind of relate in a special way, right, as the story goes, and to have them be like an example of how one can relate to him, and maybe a pattern for other people groups to follow, if you will. A light on a hill, I think. A city on a hill for all the world to see, this being a reference to Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And whereas when you get to Christianity, this becomes, I guess, in a sense, spiritualized. Like here was also a very, like, Jewish thought, and the people in the Old Testament were very much tied to a land for a good portion of their history. As the story goes, right, they were enslaved in Egypt, and he delivered them from Egypt through Moses, delivered the people from Egypt, and brought them back to, the land of their ancestors, if you will, to, and both because he wanted to give them a land, but also ostensibly because he was fed up with the evil of some of the people, at least in this land. He wanted them to come in and essentially wipe out. And this is where one of the first instances of genocide, if not the first instance of genocide being commanded. You get into the Pentateuch and you look at the messages he relays through Moses and reiterates again through Joshua that, hey, we're going to go into this land to possess it, which in many cases, not necessarily with every people group that they encounter there, but for the most part, he's like, hey, no, wipe them all out. Kill everybody. And even if you want to argue, well, he was using hyperbole. Okay, why would you say that? I don't give a fuck if you're using hyperbole. Why would you say kill everybody, even the babies, even the pregnant women, and in many cases like the cattle as well, like the animals who had not done shit. And from a human perspective, the Israelites, as the story goes, if you propose that it's a somewhat accurate rendering of history, they'd been in Egypt for what, at that point, 400 years, as the biblical account goes, right? So the people currently living in Canaan had not done a damn thing to harm any Israelite, right? And they weren't even necessarily known as it, but people in Canaan, they hadn't done anything to harm them, not a damn thing. And even as they're supposedly coming through, they're traveling through these other people's lands, like they're basically like a potentially invasive force. So why wouldn't you respond, and treat them as a potential threat? You have this large group of people traveling through your land. They didn't ask your permission. They're just walking through your land. And so I'm getting down to one of the other instances of genocide. You have the Amalekite people. So the Amalekite people, they were one of the countries that the Israelites either passed through their land or right next to their territory as they were on their journey out of Egypt, or going around the wilderness and eventually coming back to the land of Canaan. They either crossed through or right next to the Amalekites' territory. So you see this ostensibly, million plus people group just walking through the desert, either near or in your territory. Now you're going to have some people, which, again, according to the biblical account, there were some Amalekites who used this as an opportunity to rob and attack some of the weaker Israelites, which that's not okay. Like, that's kind of despicable, right? But on the flip side, why would you not see them as a potential threat? This huge group of people just traveling through, many of whom were armed, right? Yeah, you'd be a little scared, right? I would. So why would you, might not be smart to be antagonistic, but according to the accounts, like, they had some skirmishes, they had some fights, a few Israelites died, but a lot more Amalekites died in the earlier skirmishes. There was some harassment and some robbery, basically, that happened. And from time to time, like after the Israelites had, already possessed part of the land of Canaan and started building their own little empire there, small though it was, like, supposedly over the years, again, this is according to the biblical accounts, the Amalekites attacked them a few more times. And you get to around the time of Saul, which this is roughly what, 1000 BCE, somewhere in that range, 1000 to 900 BCE, roughly. Don't quote me on that. But just spitballing here. You get roughly around that period, depending on how you date, the kingdom of like David, Saul, etc. That time period, supposedly the height of Israel's kingdom, if you will, or their empire, if you want to call it that. The Amalekites, still from time to time were attacking, harassing, and they were, some of the Amalekites, obviously not all the Amalekites, but some of the Amalekites were robbing Israelites, and so they were still antagonistic. Which, again, you see these people go come in, and they, again, if the story has any bearing in history, they're like wiping out entire people groups, killing thousands and thousands and thousands of people, killing cattle, destroying cities, and conquering this land, right? And you've heard the stories. It's like, I think it's fair to say that the Israelites already established themselves as an antagonist in the area. So why would the Amalekites not want to be defensive, in that regard, and be prepared? Probably not smart to antagonize this people group. Not a smart thing necessarily. But God, as the story goes, this is from, I think, I think it's First Samuel, either First Samuel or First Kings. I think it might have been told in both places. But I think the clearest account is in First Samuel. I want to say chapter 15. I'll need to go back and look that up. But it's in the historic books, as you would call it. This story, God, this is Yahweh, which again, if you hold that Jesus and Yahweh are the same person, this is also Jesus, comes to Saul. So Jesus is like, hey, Saul. So I'm really pissed off. I know he's not using this language. This is, I'm really angry at the Amalekites. They, and the reason he cites is like, they opposed my people back when I was bringing them into the land. So this is like referring to a handful of attacks and robberies that occurred as the Israelites were passing either through Amalekite land or adjacent to it. Some of the attacks, and then there was a conflict as well. There was a fight, a battle with the Amalekites, and this had happened. At this point, I think some 300 or 400 years prior to him coming to King Saul and being like, "Hey, I'm still angry about what they did 300 years ago, even though everybody who was responsible for that is now dead." He's like, "I'm still angry." So because of that, because of what they did, and this is the reason he cites, because of what they did 300-400 years ago, I want you to go down there and I want you to kill all of them. I want you to wipe them out. Every last one of them. Down to the last unborn child in his mother's belly. Rip open their bellies, kill the children, kill the moms, and the cattle, all the animals too. Like, wipe everything out. And lest you think he was using hyperbole, when Saul gets back, what does Yahweh/Jesus get angry about? The fact that Saul didn't kill everybody. Like, he left the king alive for whatever reason. That doesn't really make any damn sense. Like, why would you leave the king alive and kill everybody else? I don't, all the women, children, men, like soldiers, the court, king's court. You just left the king alive. It's a little weird, but for whatever reason, Saul decided to leave the king alive. And he instead of killing all the cattle, all the animals that they possessed. Sorry, my alarm's going off here. Instead of killing all the cattle, he took them as booty, basically, as I can't think of the word right now, but the spoils of war, essentially. Well, this wasn't a war, this was a massacre. As the story goes, this was a massacre. They massacred everybody. Everyone. Again, down to the last baby and unborn baby. At Yahweh's command. And what does Yahweh get mad about? Is he mad that it's like, hey, Saul, I didn't actually say that to you. No, I didn't mean that. I didn't want you to actually go and wipe them out. You committed genocide. What the fuck, man? Like, no, he gets mad that he left the king alive and didn't kill all the animals. It's like, hey, you didn't do the job. So no, this wasn't hyperbole. He wanted Saul to kill every living thing in Amalek. So it's instances like this, combined with the way that Yahweh interacts with his people. Like, so he refers to Israel, this analogy, the metaphor, I guess, is used quite a few times, like refers to them as his bride. So they're seen as his bride, which this is like, and so then if you look at the passages where he's talking to her as if she's his bride. The prophets in particular are places where she's often referred to. Israel is referred to as female, as his bride. Keep in mind, this is within a patriarchal structure, within a patriarchal culture, where women were often treated as property in many ways, and as lesser than men. They certainly weren't in places of power. in very rare cases did they have any official power, at least. They may have had influence behind the scenes, if you will, but in terms of being in any kind of official positions of power, be it in the home or be it in the kingdom, whatever you have, that was very rare. It was male-dominated patriarchal structures. So that's the culture that's been communicated to. And instead of saying, hey, you need to change, he basically reinforces it by the way that he talks to them. And he accuses Israel repeatedly of being unfaithful, of being an unfaithful wife, of sleeping around, basically worshiping other gods, making sacrifices to other gods. And even when they're sacrificing their children, it seems obvious that it seems like what he's more upset about is the fact that they sacrificed their children to another god, not just that they sacrificed their kids, but that they did it to another god. And that's what he's really angry about. And this is the equivalent of cheating on him, basically, as their husband. Hey, you cheated on me with these other gods. You slept with these other, So what is his response to that? So when you look through the prophets, things like Jeremiah, in particular, Ezekiel, different places, Isaiah, these prophetic books where God is ostensibly speaking through the prophet, and they're, from our perspective, at least in modern times, like giving Jeremiah or these people giving a direct quote. They're directly quoting Yahweh, and they would probably be afraid to do anything else, right? Afraid to misrepresent him, so they're trying to quote him as accurately as possible, give a direct quote of what they claim that Yahweh told them, and they're relaying this to Israel. So what is Yahweh/Jesus? Again, this is Jesus, right? By Orthodox standards, like Jesus, Yahweh, same person, same being. What is he saying to his bride? So you kind of have a twofold approach. On the one hand, he is expressing his anger. He's saying, I can't believe you cheated on me, these horrible things you did. So he's calling her out for her cheating. And even if it's true, that, hey, your spouse cheated on you. So then he's saying, he threatens her repeatedly with violence. Like, in some cases, I'm going to kill you for what you did, And there's some cases where he's just straight up, I'm going to kill you, or I'm going to beat you. His equivalent, right? Now, he's not literally, because at this point he's not corporeal, he's not literally going to come down and beat them up individually. No, instead he threatens to use other nations like Assyria, Babylon later on, to come and essentially beat up his spouse, make her a slave, turn her into a slave, abduct her, beat her, rape her. He uses words like this. I'm going to have them come in. The soldiers are going to rape your wives. They're going to rape your women. They're going to bash your children's head against the rock at my command, basically, because you cheated on me. I'm going to do these things. And he's like, I can't believe you cheated. Like, look at all the, and he reminds her, like, look at all the wonderful things I've done for you. I can't believe you cheated on me. So he's like, I'm going to do all these horrible things to you. So he's threatening her with violence. But then he's like, but I'm willing to take you back. If you're willing to repent, admit what you did was wrong, come back to me, recommit yourself in a sense to being faithful to me, stop having sex with these other gods, basically, stop cheating on me with these other gods, I'll take you back. But in the same passage sometimes, but if you then leave again, then I will kill you, I will murder you, I will rape you, I will beat you, I will send you away as slaves, So looking at this analogy, I think it's fair. And again, I know I'm judging this from a modern moral perspective. I understand that. But when I see that, I'm like, that's abuse. It's horrible abuse. Like, imagine if, as a husband, you treated your wife that way. Even if she did cheat on you, you might feel like if, depending on how attached you were to her or how possessive as a husband you were, you might feel like killing her because of what she did. But what kind of husband would you be if you actually said that shit and not only once, but repeatedly, and then you did beat her. And let's say you sold her to human traffickers, right? You let her become a slave. Like you sold her into slavery, basically, or just stood back while others enslaved her. And you beat her, threatened to kill her. But then you're like, but if you stop doing it, if you promise not to do it again, I'll take you back. After you'd already beaten her and threatened her and yelled at her. Like, that's abuse, right? And again, even if she cheated, which not saying that's okay, even if she did, is it okay to then beat her and that's Jesus, right? That's how he treats his bride. Because Jesus is Yahweh and Yahweh is Jesus. So yes, Jesus treated his bride that way. He said those things to his bride. And I get you the more sanitized, slightly more sanitized New Testament, but there's still, the old threats are still there. You get to the book of Revelation, you get to the book of Hebrews, and even through some of Paul's writing, and even through some of Jesus' teachings, alleged teachings, right? Because again, he didn't write anything down. Only his followers did decades later, so his alleged teachings. There's still the threats in there, right? And then you get to Orthodox Christian doctrine, you get into the doctrine of hell. Honestly, the threat is exponentially worse because it's not only, before it was just like, hey, I'm gonna beat you, you're gonna be enslaved, and then you die and you go to Sheol and that's it, right? So at least the abuse is only in this life, right? But then now he's like, no, not only is that kind of shit gonna happen to you, but now I'm gonna, if you take the doctrine that I was taught in evangelical Christianity, evangelical American Christianity, I'm going to supernaturally keep you alive forever and torture you in fire, burn you alive, but not let you die for eternity. Because you cheated on me. You didn't love me the way I wanted you to love me. You ran away with this other husband. Or you could say, or because you refused to marry me in the first place. I proposed to you, right? I offered you salvation. I proposed to you. I offered you opportunity to be my bride, but because you refused, now I'm going to supernaturally keep you alive forever and torture you. And I know not all Christians hold to that view of the afterlife for unbelievers, right? Some hold the idea of annihilation, where it's like, you're just going to miss out on eternal life, basically. You're not going to get to be in paradise with me forever. You're just going to cease to exist after you die, which, you could argue, well, that's not any worse than what the atheists believe, like you just die and that's it, right? Or the naturalists, you name it. It's like, that's like best case scenario, but again, the tradition I grew up in taught eternal conscious torment, right? In general, like, you're going to hell if you either refuse to marry him in the first place, or then if you're like, yeah, I'll marry you, but then you cheat on him, you leave him, this is what's going to happen. So not only do you get talked to in a way that's abusive and abused during your life, I'm going to torture you forever. And you put this into religious context where you're trying to gain converts, like, how is this not coercive? And again, I understand there are Christian traditions and there are groups and churches that don't emphasize those things, that have a quote-unquote kinder perspective on God. But I'm like, at the end of the day, I think you're fooling yourself, because if you go back to the root, you go back to the book, you go back to the Bible, this is the character of the being that's presented there. Now you can pick the parts that you like, the parts that are more palatable, find ways to explain away his behavior in a way that doesn't make him look like a monster. You can try to do that, but at the end of the day, and again, this is all dealing in hypotheticals, right? Treating this as a potential person. And I think the reality is that the entire thing is fictional, right? If you want to get down to reality, this is all fictional. Like, Yahweh never really existed, in my opinion. Like, Yahweh, the specific entity Yahweh. This has no bearing on whether there's a God or gods or higher beings, higher forms of intelligence in the universe. There's no bearing on that question. It's like, but specifically the Jewish concept Yahweh, and the Christian concept of Jesus, like, there might have been a Jewish prophet, self-appointed prophet, who gained a following, and then his followers deified him later. That's possible. A lot of scholars do think there was a real person behind the legends and the religion. And I do think that's legitimately possible. That's a possibility. It's also possible the entire thing was made up. That Jesus himself, the religious Jesus was basically a fabrication. That's also possible. Either way, Yahweh come in flesh, because Yahweh didn't exist in the first place. You can't have Yahweh come down and become a human. It's so the whole thing is fictionalized, mythologized. It's mythology basically, and it's used to get people to join your religion. That doesn't necessarily mean the people attempting that are being malicious. They themselves may believe it, and believe that it's what's best. I've known many people. I was one of them, right? Like, I was well-intentioned. I thought it was true. Was trying my best to continue believing that it was true even when I had doubts. Shared it with other people. Wanted those people to be a part of it too, because I thought that's what was best for everyone. And I'm like, no. Now, does that mean I think that everything about Christianity is bad and evil and that there's nothing good in it, no redeeming quality? No, absolutely not. At the end of the day, it's a human system. It's something that we fabricated, that we invented. And there are things in it that have genuinely been beneficial to humanity. But there are also elements of it, and I think these, at the end of the day, in my opinion, outweigh the good, which is one of the reasons why I left. I think the bad and the harm that it's done outweighs the good, and I think we just need to let it go and make something new, that we need to move beyond it. I'm not saying that's easy. It sure as hell, pun intended, is not easy. It is not easy to make something new, and it's not wholly new. Obviously, it's not whole. You're not making it out of whole cloth. Like, no, like, it's built on other traditions. It's a descendant of those other traditions. And we can take the things that have been genuinely beneficial and good and beautiful from that religious tradition and take them with us. We don't have to leave them. And I guess that's still where I'm at. Is like, I'm looking for ways to move beyond it, to grow beyond it, to make something new, in a sense. While still trying to maintain connection and attachment with the people that are in it. Like, I don't want to just cut them off unless I absolutely have to. I don't want to do that. I want to, if I can, continue to have connection and relationship with those people. As long as I can maintain my own mental health in doing so, and have healthy boundaries in certain areas, I want to continue doing that. But yeah, like, and even recently, like, I've tried to give it the benefit of the doubt again, tried to re-examine it a bit, and I want to continue understanding it better, the tradition itself, from a human perspective. I want to understand it better. But the big picture idea of Orthodox Christianity, every time I try to revisit it or give it the benefit of the doubt again, I keep coming back to the same place, and that has remained true for the last 4 years. I keep retesting. Every time I retest it, I come back to the same place. Like, this isn't okay, and we need to move beyond it as a species. We need to move beyond it. Not saying that's easy. It's not going to happen overnight. That doesn't mean I want to go annihilate the entire religion or everybody that's in it, or just yank people out of it indiscriminately. I don't think that's helpful. And for some, you may never be able to leave it. It may be so ingrained in your psyche that you can't function without it, and that's legitimate. And it's unfortunate, but may legitimately be true. So it's not an easy path, and charting a new path, making new traditions. And again, I'm not saying wholly new. Like, these are just adaptations, if you will, of other existing traditions. At the end of the day, there's almost nothing new under the sun, if you will. Not wholly new. You know what I'm saying? Like, but yeah, we need to move beyond it. We need to let go of this book and the belief that this is actually the creator of the universe, Yahweh, Jesus. Like, and as I think I've said before, it's like, I hope not. Academically, empirically, I think it's highly unlikely, but then just personally, it's like, I hope not. Anyway, that's all I have to say. This actually went longer than I thought it would. So that's where I'm at. My deconstruction story 3 years later, still don't identify as a Christian. I think my reasons for not identifying as a Christian anymore are good. I think they're healthy reasons. Does that mean I want to destroy everything about it? That I think it's, you know, the most evil thing on the planet, or that I need to cut myself off from all the people that adhere to it? No, I don't think that's a good or healthy approach at all. I still want to interact with it. I want to understand it better, and I want to still have friendships as much as I'm able to with people that are part of it. Because they're my fellow humans at the end of the day, and that's kind of where I'm at with it. Now 3 years, since I went public, 3 years later. And in a sense, that was really the solidifying of that decision to leave, was when I went public with that. Not necessarily recommending that for everybody. I don't think that's necessarily a healthy decision for everybody to go public. It's arguable whether it was for me, but where I was at the time, I felt like I had to go public in order to break free from it. That's kind of where I was at. I don't know if I'd been able to fully break free had I not gone public, but it's hard to say for sure. But it's the decision I made. So here I am 3 years later, kind of reflecting on that again and sharing a bit of like where I'm at now. So hey, thanks for watching. For those of you that made it all the way to the end here, thanks for watching and listening. And ecologist, let's see if I can remember my ending here. All right, ecologist, stay healthy, be curious. Yeah, be kind.